So Dragon Age Origins actually started development way back in 2002 when Neverwinter Nights shipped. Some of that team stayed on and made expansion packs and modules for Neverwinter Nights, but the remainder of the team started working on what would eventually become Dragon Age. This is before I was actually on the project because I was, as you know, on Jade Empire, and then I was on Sonic, and then I was on Revolver. So during this time, from 2002 until the cancellation of Revolver in 2008, I was watching Dragon Age from the outside. And what you saw was some chaos, to be honest. The technology stream changed. First, it was being built on the Neverwinter Nights engine, which had been tweaked and mutilated and modified. Then it got merged in with TAG in order to have a common tech base there. It was multiplayer, then it wasn't multiplayer, then it was multiplayer, and then it wasn't multiplayer again. But in the background, behind the scenes at the same time, work was still happening. From 2002 to 2008, this game was coming together. You know, I think there is a lesson here. I think that in studios that have multiple projects on the go, especially ones that have very long dev cycles like BioWare has, there can be a tendency to look over the fence at the other project and just see a burning trash fire. Partially because there's a tendency to think that the way that your team does things is the right way, partially because that project is at a different phase, so their problems aren't the same as your problems. Partially it's jealousy, partially it's insecurity, but I think that it's useful to remember that teams are made of people. The people on that other project line aren't just suddenly idiots because they have changed what franchise they're working on. Dragon Age Origins was always intended to be the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. That was how we were pitching it to publishers before we got bought by EA, and really that was kind of the way that it was thought of. Where Neverwinter Nights was seen as a bit of a departure from Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age was trying to be both Neverwinter Nights and Baldur's Gate at the same time. So a good, strong story, good combat, and a tool set. But you can start to see why multiplayer was a feature that bounced in and out of consciousness for this game. Multiplayer, while it existed for Baldur's Gate, wasn't a critical feature for that game. Whereas for Neverwinter, it was a pretty core part of that game. So depending on how the wind was blowing, you kind of saw multiplayer as a critical part of the feature set or as extraneous. As time was going on, as both Mass Effect and Dragon Age were developing, they both were actually without a name for quite a long time. In the case of Dragon Age, I think this story is well known. Basically what was done was that a list of fantasy words was created, and those two lists were smashed against each other to generate possible names for the game. So you had things like Sword Dark and Griffin Height and various other things, like probably hundreds of them. And then those lists were called down and things were voted on until eventually Dragon Age was what was chosen for the name of the game. I've done an entire video about naming things and about how you don't need to stress so much about naming things. Dragon Age as a name may be the quintessential example of that. In those days, before Dragon Age was the name of the title, there were no dragons in the game. The archdemon was actually more like an angel kind of figure, which makes sense. It's called an archdemon. It's not called an epic dragon or an archdragon. It's called an archdemon. And there were no dragons at all. But of course, once it was called Dragon Age, you kind of needed to have some dragons in it, didn't you? And make that make sense in the lore. So basically, the lore and game was retrofitted to accommodate the name because there'd been no other names that were able to be chosen. And that's why when you look at Dragon Age Origins, there aren't actually that many dragons in there because it was never intended to be about dragons. And so you have the High Dragon, you have the Archdemon, and basically that's about it. But like I said in the naming video, almost all names can be fine eventually. Dragon Age isn't objectively a great name. It has problematic word forms and mouthfeel and You know, you can make fun of it by calling it Dragonage or making a joke about how old is your dragon, but it's fine and it gets the job done. One of the quintessential features of Dragon Age Origins is the thing that gives it the subtitle, the Origins. There are 6 different origins, 2 for Dwarf, 2 for Elf, Human, Noble, and then the Mage origin. Originally there was a 7th, which was essentially the mirror to the other races, which would have been Human Commoner, but it wouldn't have been called Human Commoner because you would have actually played as the Avar out in the Kakari Wilds for your origin. Origins are an interesting and troublesome feature for me because one of the great things about Origins is that they allow you to establish a view upon the world that is different depending on which origin you choose. They allow you to really set the hook of the setting in different ways, and they inherently give the game replayability. Even though the rest of the game is fairly similar, there is some reactivity to your origin, to your race, to your class, but the rest of it is fairly similar. Those origins really set your experience up as very different every time you play a different one. But because it's right up front at the very beginning of the game, you have to do your tutorials 6 times, or originally 7 times, because that's the place where you're learning how to play your game. So while I think from a storytelling perspective, from a world establishment perspective, Origins are excellent, they are a bit of a nightmare from the perspective of controlling your scope, because tutorials are one of the hardest things to implement because they have to be done very late and they need to be educational without being boring. They need to onboard the player at a proper pace. And at the same time, you're also onboarding the player into the world setting. So signing yourself up to do that 6 separate times is kind of insane. Okay, maybe 2 lessons here. When you are thinking about features, don't pick a feature that requires you to implement your tutorial 6 separate times. But sometimes that weird thing, that ill-advised thing, that not fully considered thing is going to be the feature that sets your game apart, that makes the game memorable. Don't strip all the interesting things out of your game just because they might be hard to implement. Now we are reaching the point where Revolver is canceled. A bunch of the people that were on Revolver go on to Mass Effect. Some of them come on to Dragon Age. Pretty much all of the leadership from Revolver goes on to Dragon Age. But we're not actually on Dragon Age Origins at this point. We actually start out on preliminary work of Dragon Age 2. Some of that work would go into actually Dragon Age 2. Some of it would actually end up being the basis for Inquisition. So there's me, and there's Mike Laidlaw as the creative director, and there's Matt Goldman as the art director on Dragon Age 2. But then over a little bit of time, the creative director of Dragon Age Origins leaves, and Mike moves on, and then the executive producer leaves, and I take over the project to ship it. We're right at late 2008 at this point, and so Dragon Age Origins has just started the process of finishing up and then starting the process of getting onto the consoles. One of the things that came out of the acquisition by EA was they didn't want a PC-only game, they wanted this game to be on the consoles as well, which certainly was the right call because it definitely expands your market dramatically. So I'm taking over Dragon Age Origins. It's not done, there's still lots of work to do, but also we are starting the process of porting this thing. Something that becomes very clear about Dragon Age Origins when I'm taking over, now I'm attending triages, now we're trying to land this game, is that Dragon Age Origins doesn't actually have a lot of places you can cut anything. Some of that is because things have been cut along the way, like the Avar origin was a fairly easy cut that was made before I took over. But also it's because the content in Dragon Age Origins is kind of all knit together in this way where if you start pulling on something, you have to pull a lot to make any savings. Let me give you some examples. So let's say you want to cut the Deep Roads from Dragon Age Origins. The Deep Roads basically uses the Orzammar tile set for most of its world building. So if you just cut the Deep Roads, You save a couple of relatively simple levels, but that's about it. You can cut the Broodmother, but of course it hollows out the dwarf acquisition missions, so you kind of have to cut the return to Orzammar at that point, but you still haven't saved very much. You've cut out a bunch of content for the player, hours of content, but you've saved a couple of levels and a creature or two. The only way you get a really big saving from cutting the deep roads is by cutting dwarves. Because if you cut dwarves, then you save 2 entire origins, you cut the entire tile set, you cut Orzammar, you cut the deep roads, you cut the Broodmother. There's a huge savings there. But this is actually the case with a lot of content. You don't save very much by cutting the werewolves part of Dragon Age unless you go as far as to cut the elf origin story as well. The lesson here, the lesson I took away from this, is that when you are building your content plan, it's good for things to be cross-connected. It's good to look for opportunities to save and to reuse, but you also need to consider what a smaller version of what you're building looks like. If you fail to do this, you end up in a situation where you have no choice but to build the thing that you started out planning to build. And sometimes you're going to discover that that's actually not the thing you want to build anymore. It might not always even be about scope control. It might not always be about cutting. It might just be about wanting to have a tighter, better experience. If everything is knit together into a big knot, you lose the ability to do that. In the case of Dragon Age Origins, some of this cross connection is coming from this symmetry that appears throughout the game. So you have 2 origins for each of the races, or at least that was the original plan, and the combat system is perfectly symmetrical as well, meaning that when you shoot somebody with a bow, you do exactly the same amount of damage as when they shoot you with the same bow. And this seems like on the surface that this is of course the way that it should work. It's the way that 3rd edition D&D worked. But much like Wizards of the Coast has discovered through 3rd edition D&D, 4th edition D&D, and then finally 5th edition D&D, there is a problem with being perfectly symmetrical. It's basically impossible to balance. If everyone is using the same weapons and doing the same damage, if you make a change to the rate of fire of a bow late in the day, which happened in Dragon Age Origins, not only do you make player bows better, you also make every single Hurlock with a bow better as well, and accidentally make the game way harder. So having the game be perfectly symmetrical from a gameplay perspective is highly problematic. It is basically nearly impossible to balance. Now, we'll talk about this when I talk about Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2, much like 4th edition D&D, swung the pendulum way too far in the opposite direction and made something so asymmetrical that it's almost incomprehensible. But you need to strike a balance in the middle where you are symmetrical enough to be understandable, but not so beholden to the god of symmetry that you are trapped from the perspective of balance. It's ironic that I used the Dwarf Commoner as the footage that I'm using for this video, because Orzammar actually has a distinctly Dragon Age art direction. Much of the rest of the game, like Ostagar, has this sort of generic fantasy look. If you look at fantasy games that are contemporary with Dragon Age Origins, what you see is they all kind of look the same. They have this problem where you can't look at a screenshot and know that it is the game that it is. And that's a problem. You want your game to be able to stand out on its own and look like what it is and be identifiable. Otherwise, your screenshots aren't really doing you much good because they're just blending into the mass of generic fantasy screenshots. So there's this almost pathological need to sort of quantify fantasy settings. 2 common ways to do this is going from dark fantasy to epic fantasy and from low fantasy to high fantasy. Dark fantasy being much more focused on darker themes, epic fantasy more save the world, that kind of thing. Low fantasy, relatively low magic, high fantasy, potentially flying magical cities. I think there are a lot of problems with both of these categorizations because I think sometimes dark fantasy is seen through this this rather simplistic lens of it's dark because it has sex and it's bloody. Whereas I would argue that it's dark if it has darker themes. Those of you who've been playing Dragon Age games all the way along have been noticing that Dragon Age has been sort of moving up this 2x2 towards more epic and higher levels of magic. Not that Dragon Age 2 and Dragon Age Inquisition don't have dark themes, but it's been moving away from some of the more simplistic definitions of dark, at least. Less blood, less torture, less casually mentioned sexual assault. And why is this? So for me, it's a couple of reasons. One, with Western RPGs, a lot of fantasy games actually sit in this sort of low, dark space. The Witcher, bam, is right there. So partially it has been an attempt to move away from the competition, but also it's been just the way the team has wanted to go. Because, to be frank, low magic, dark fantasy can become a little oppressive to work on. By slowly ramping the magic level up over the last couple of games, it opens up the toolbox. It gives the opportunity for more interesting visuals, a more distinctive art style, which, like I just mentioned, is something you really want to have. By moving from this sort of really grim, dark aspects of a pure dark fantasy into more epic themes, you're able to have something that's a little bit less psychologically wearing to work on. I'm not sure where Dragon Age 4 is going to land, but I do think that this trend will continue into Dragon Age 4. And I actually support it fully. One of the longer parts of Dragon Age Origins is the Mage Tower, followed by the Fade. This is an example of why you need to consider your interstitials and how you get from one place to another when you are writing your story. Because the impactful, important part of the Tower and the Fade is supposed to be where you get to the Sloth Demon and you get bumped into the Fade and you figure everything else out there. The lead up to that doesn't really contain very much story. There's a little bit of world building around the Rite of Annulment and stuff. From a storytelling perspective, it's largely you go to the tower, oh no, something crazy is going on. Okay, don't worry, I'm the warden, I'll go figure it out. You go in, something happens, Sloth Demon, Fade, come out, you win, Mage is on your side. But you notice one part that I'm jumping over there is the tower. The tower, when it was originally implemented, was implemented with basically just those story beats there. And when you were in the tower, what you found was you were moving through all of this space that had been created for the Mage origin, and there was not really anything to do. So we figured we needed to fill this space. So this was Luke's job. Luke spent a couple of days and wrote a bunch of quests and lore and side things to fill up this space. But of course, this wasn't part of the pacing originally. So now what you've got is the Tower plus the Fade, which are two quests essentially back to back that you have to do in order, are a huge chunk of gameplay right in the middle of the game where you can't do anything else, because the tower part, which didn't contain much critical path storytelling, had been not fully considered from the perspective of pacing. And then when we came in to fill it with the content that it needed to feel lived in and alive, the length was just stretched beyond all comprehension. Now, of course, one of the reasons for this expansion, beyond simply a lack of consideration for the interstitials for the connections, is that the Mage Tower was also used for a different part of the game, for the Mage origin. So as that plot was completed and needed more space and the space expanded, it was inadvertently expanding the space for this plot. So one other consequence of these tight Gordian knots of interconnected content is that every change to any piece of content is going to affect some other part of the game in maybe not fully considered way. But as long as we're here, as long as we're talking about this section of gameplay, we do also need to talk about the Fade, because in the Fade, you are originally by yourself. And there used to be quite a bit of combat in this section, but of course you could build yourself a pure support healer mage, which would be awesome with your party of 3 other companions. But if you're on your own, was suddenly completely incapable of finishing this content. So when you're building a game that is about a party, you have to be very careful careful about when you take away that party, because it is a completely legitimate playstyle, even an encouraged playstyle, to build a character who can support the rest of the party. But if they suddenly find themselves on their own, they may be incapable of actually winning a fight, and you've never prepared them for the possibility that that might occur. This really is a lesson that I think needs to be considered for all games, not specifically about a party, but about taking mechanics away from players. It's quite common, or it used to be even more common, for games in their final bosses or near their final bosses to remove some piece of gameplay that you had been used to using throughout the rest of the game. But of course, for some players, it's not a big deal. They weren't using the elbow drop. So now you've taken the elbow drop away, they don't really care, or they use it some. But some players were 100% reliant upon that ability to win their fights. So taking that away, you've completely changed the game out from under them and not had any training for them to work without that. If you're going to do that, if you plan to change the landscape of gameplay by removing features and adding features and changing the way that things work, this is an expectation you need to set a lot earlier, and you need to provide the player with training in order to accommodate that. The Final Fantasy Tactics game actually do a fairly good job of this because they have different rules for each combat. You can't use archers in this combat, or you have to move at half speed, and they set this expectation that the rule system, the playing field, is going to shift under you, and you need to take that into account. You need to not play always in the same way. So if you are going to do that, and I think it's a legitimate thing to do, you need to set that expectation along the way and provide that training. A lot of my job on Dragon Age Origins was to land it. The story had been written and rewritten and was well established. The technology was mostly there, and we were getting the last of the content in, filling in things like the tower, knitting it all together, and then getting it onto the consoles. So because the consoles came in relatively late for Dragon Age Origins as a feature set, we got to do something that basically games never get to do, which was finish and then step back and look at what we had. But you need to be disciplined when you find yourself with this opportunity. The game was basically done in early 2009, and we were getting it onto the consoles. And there was tons of work involved in that, but there was also this opportunity. You had much of the team looking at this game and thinking, man, we could make this so much better. But of course, if you open the game back up wide at this point, then you're never going to make it, because that console port is not going to happen. The game is going to destabilize and it's going to become a mess. But what you can do is make a few very targeted, very specific fixes and improvements to address the biggest impact items that you see. Is there a lesson here going forward for other game making? I think there might be. If we move to a world where games start doing post-production or long betas, we might start to see games have this opportunity again, where they finish and then they stabilize, and during this stabilization process where they are doing the final bits of bug fixing and they are in beta and they're balancing and they're doing these sorts of things, they could open the hood up for very selective things to make very pointed improvements. Are we going to see this kind of development across the industry? Honestly, I don't think so, because what you're basically saying is, what if we just added 4 extra months of development onto the end of every single game? I don't see that happening. I don't see anyone being prepared to just spend extra money, but, I've been wrong before. One of the things that actually I am proudest of on Dragon Age Origins is how well that project controlled its bugs. It did triage really early. It stopped and controlled the open count when things got out of hand. And instead of having this sharp, steep curve rising until well past alpha and then this brutal process of trying to bring that count down. Instead, it rose relatively early, but stayed at a moderate level through much of production and post-production. That's one of the reasons why I advocate for triage early, as well as finding ways to fix bugs along the way, because the more you can control your bug list earlier, the less useless your bug list is going to be, and the more value you're going to get out of the bugs in the database in the first place. So getting something with a longer, flatter curve, I think is far superior to something where you have an inrush of bugs post-alpha, and then you have to scramble to try to get them all fixed. I think we can't talk about Dragon Age Origins without talking about some of the things that were done in the marketing and in the post-release. Okay, Warden's Quest. What in the world was Warden's Quest? Warden's Quest was a 24-hour play session where we brought in teams from different nations who played Dragon Age Origins for 24 hours, and then the people who did the best won $50,000. So you might be thinking, what in the world did the best mean? Well, that's a very good question. It was something that was basically how far in the story they got. So did it work? Well, kind of worked, but here's actually, I think, a lesson that can be learned from this kind of marketing event. So Warden's Quest cost about $500,000 to put on because it was done in London. We had to rent a big space. There was travel. There was setup. We had to fly these people in. There was just a lot of costs involved, but we only gave away $50,000. So it wasn't particularly newsworthy, so it didn't really get picked up by any press, so it didn't really do much from a marketing perspective. But if you think about the fact that the sort of fixed costs of this thing were, what, $450,000 plus the $50,000 we gave away, for $950,000 we could have given away $500,000 instead of $50,000. So for less than double the budget, we could have given away 10 times as much money. And I think that would have probably crossed into noteworthy. Certainly noteworthy for the gaming press, maybe even noteworthy for some of the bigger news outlets. There is a lesson there that your stunt needs to be big enough to be worth the attention that you are trying to garner. If it fails to do that, then there's a reasonable chance that you're going to put in all this effort and you're going to do this relatively outlandish thing and it's not going to accomplish anything. The other big press event that I remember from Dragon Age Origins is the European press tour that I did. So this was, I think, 8 countries in 7 days or 7 countries in 6 days. Let me see. So we flew into Madrid. So I think we did Madrid, Germany. We flew into Switzerland to take the train into France. Then we did the UK and flew from the UK to Poland. So I guess it was 6 countries in 7 days. Brutal. If you've ever done a press tour, you are literally getting into a country late at night, waking up the next morning, doing your demo, doing your patter, and then getting on a plane to go to the next destination. There is no time to really pause or rest. It can be pretty effective because a lot of these countries don't get a lot of attention from North American developers, so it can really get you some attention in those territories. It was quite an event. The senior dev director was actually traveling ahead of the rest of the group in order to make sure that the hardware was all set up and ready for us as we arrived in place. The only place that she was actually in the city at the same time as us was in Lyon in France, and that was when I got to see Bruce almost get into a fist fight with a cab driver. Dragon Age Origins really leaned into pushing the Warden both as a faction that was really cool, but also as a character that was going to be really cool to play. Maybe did too good of a job of that, because on Dragon Age 2 you were definitely having to deal with people assuming that, of course, I have to play a Warden. Wardens are awesome. Wardens are what this IP is all about. That was never the intention. The marketing was probably way overplayed on playing up the Wardens as the coolest thing ever. But the reality is that I kind of, in retrospect, understand why this happened. It's a lot easier to sell a person as super cool, to sell a power fantasy of of what you're going to do through the lens of a role than it is to sell a setting or to sell a game on its own. So the lesson there is that people just market better if you have a person that you can anchor your marketing off of. It's just going to be easier. This is why most RPGs, even those that have very deep character customization, usually end up having an iconic player character that's used for their marketing. Viking guy from Skyrim. A lot of the ones in Dragon Age end up with being guy with sword. The default shepherd that's used in Mass Effect. This is just to give something to anchor the marketing on because it's easier to understand. But it does set you up a little bit of a problem because sometimes people get a bit confused and think, oh, wait a minute, can I not play as a woman? Or can I not play as a man? Are the races not available? So you need it, but you also need to provide enough information for the people that are interested in this wider agency of character choice that exists in RPGs can find that information and know that that exists. Let's talk about the Marilyn Manson trailer. This is the new shit, for those of you who don't remember this trailer. So the Marilyn Manson trailer is designed for one purpose and one purpose only. It's designed to kind of wake up the game-buying public, get them to pay attention to Dragon Age, a game which had been announced way back in 2003. Get them to remember the game exists, get them to pay attention. Here's my hot take on the Marilyn Manson trailer. I think it did its job. I think it put Dragon Age back on the map where it had lost its position. I think it got people to pay attention. Would I make a trailer like that for a Dragon Age game now? I don't think so. I also don't think that a Dragon Age game coming out now has the need to rise out of the noise as much. I actually think the Marilyn Manson trailer, as much as it deserves to be made fun of, actually did what it was trying to do. As long as we're talking about music, let's talk about the 30 Seconds to Mars song over the credits. So it used to be that EA used to make with some bands because Madden used to contain a lot more modern music, popular music, and they usually went out to up-and-coming bands, and the people that ran EA Music were really great at finding bands that were about to hit it big, getting the song relatively cheaply, and then kind of helping them get there because this song would help bring them back up. I think that's what was being attempted with the 30 Seconds to Mars song in Dragon Age Origins, and I think it kind of worked. I don't know that Dragon Age Origins helped 30 Seconds to Mars become any bigger, but I kind of like the song. I think it's nice. I don't think it hurts anything. Okay, let's talk about Project $10. So Shale is the Project $10 that was done for Dragon Age Origins. Project $10 was an attempt by EA to essentially make used copies worse. Video games have this weird thing because if I go to a bookstore and I buy a book, that book is in brand new condition. If I go to a used bookstore and I buy a book, that book has been used and it's somewhat damaged, it's been degraded in some way. This is true of most physical things, is there is a distinct visual, noticeable, qualitative difference between brand new and used. But this is basically not true for video games. I mean, I can take a jewel case and damage it to the point of being pretty bad, but even then, GameStop can just put it in a new jewel case and it's going to look brand new. This has been a thing that the game industry has struggled with because the difference between new and used for video games is basically non-existent. So in 2008, 2007, EA thought, I know, what if we actually made there be a difference between new and used? And this is where Project $10 was born. Project $10 was essentially $10 of DLC that came for free with a new copy of the game. It had a burnable code that you put in that you got with the game new, but then if you put it into the used market, that code was already burned, so that game was damaged in a way. It had $10 less content. And you can imagine that went over exactly as well as you imagine. It went over terribly. And eventually the project was completely discontinued because of the PR backlash. In the case of Dragon Age Origins, that content was Shale, an extra companion that had been cut from Dragon Age Origins for time reasons because we couldn't finish her in time to get it out. And then because of the consoles, we basically got her done, and she was done for day one and therefore became Project $10. The accusation on much of the content provided in the various Project $10 was, this is content that was was removed from the game in order to hold it hostage behind this $10 price tag to be part of this attempt to make new games better than used games. And I'm sure that was the case in other games that implemented Project $10. It wasn't actually the case in Dragon Age Origins, because this was content that had been cut, wasn't ready in time to go onto the discs for the game, but was ready in time for the launch. So it was able to be part of Project $10. The code was able to be there. It wasn't cut in order to be held hostage. It had been cut for other reasons and then brought back because of the weird things that happened around the launch time. So I actually kind of think Project $10 is sort of clever. It's this clever attempt to apply some physical attributes to a basically digital product. But the reality is, the lesson here is that if your audience rejects your clever idea, it's not such a clever idea, is it? One of the other consequences of this weird period where the game was done, but we were holding it because we were porting it to the consoles, was that Dragon Age Awakenings, the expansion pack, actually was being worked upon while this was happening. So it meant that Dragon Age Awakening is arguably the last gasp of the retail expansion pack for single-player, story-driven games. And it worked pretty well because it has about a 35% attach rate. Now, that's skewed by Game of the Year editions and things like that, but it did attach pretty well because it had a retail presence and because it came out so close to when Dragon Age Origins launched, only a few months later. It wasn't so close that you were not looking to buy additional content, but it wasn't so far away that you had moved on to other things. But the reality is that expansion packs are basically things that have gone away, and I think they've gone away for a couple of reasons. What you see these days in an online world is you see DLC with a lower price point that can be made more cheaply, or you see things where you take what could have been an expansion pack and triple its size and sell it as a $60 game. And truthfully, the economics of the yearly launched game are far superior to an expansion pack where you're always fighting against attach rate, where you're always trying to get people to remember that you still exist. And ultimately, that's the lesson that these fast follow sequels for storytelling games, for single player games, are actually a very effective form of planning. They almost replace your live service with simply increasing the cadence of your titles. Maybe you don't need to go every 12 months, have your titles come out closer together, and some percentage of them being extremely large expansion packs. The scale of a full game, marketed like a full game, but without all of the technological rigmarole that often goes into big RPGs as you move from title to title. Now, unfortunately, this is a lesson that I didn't really learn until 2016 when we were pitching early Joplin. With the success of the Mass Effect remasters, Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 remasters, the question that makes sense to ask is, well, what about Dragon Age? Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, and Dragon Age 3. You have two basic options. You can do a remaster or you can do a remake. To do a remaster is a challenge because the trilogy is on two very different tech stacks. And as a result, there are just huge differences between the different things. Dragon Age Origins is not a super attractive game. It doesn't have a super distinctive art direction. In the case of a remaster, I think you just kind of have to live with that. But a remaster lets you dodge a lot of topics. There are things in Dragon Age Origins that probably are unacceptable in a modern game with modern sensibilities. For the same reason why you are shocked at how homophobic Friends is if you watch it on Netflix, Dragon Age Origins similarly has ways of addressing topics which were fine in 2009 are much less fine in 2022. If you do a remaster, I think that's okay. You just leave that all alone and you update the graphics and you call it a day. If you do a remake, you have opportunities to improve the fidelity a lot more, but I think you also now have an obligation to go in and start to address some of these issues issues as you're in there. I don't expect that EA will ever do a remake of Dragon Age, but a remaster might be possible. I would have said never, ever, ever, ever until the success of Mass Effect, but now I say, yeah, it might happen, but if it does, it will probably be a remaster. The remaster of Dragon Age Origins probably gives you 80 to 90% of Dragon Age 2 as basically a side effect, and honestly, Dragon Age Inquisition, you might get away with going in, updating its version of DirectX, putting all the 4K textures into the build and calling it a day, because honestly, Dragon Age Inquisition still looks pretty good if you crank the settings. I couldn't find a better place to put this, so I guess we'll put it here at the end. Makes sense because what I'm about to talk about was something that became an issue late in Dragon Age Origins development and continued into its live service. I have a tendency to try to bring balance to topics, bring balance to discussions. I'm sort of infamous for arguing both sides of a discussion. I think that's actually valuable. I think when you are having a discussion, if the point is to arrive at the best possible answer, then it's worthwhile to explore the space. And sometimes that means you've got to bring in data and arguments from both sides of the argument. But something that I had a tendency to do, which I hope that I've outgrown at this point, is to explain to someone who is giving an extreme stance on something why that stance isn't really valid, why they're being overly extreme, why they need to be more balanced in what they believe. And let me explain why that's highly problematic and why it doesn't actually end up working. If someone tells you that something is bad and you say things aren't really that bad, what most people are going to hear when you do that is this person isn't listening to me. They're not understanding me. I need to be more extreme in my statement of this problem so that they understand just how worried I truly am. So they go from thinking things are bad, from saying things are bad, to saying things are very bad. But of course, now, if you're someone who wants to bring balance, they're trying to pull the pendulum even further out of center. So your natural instinct is to react by even more strongly pulling back the other way. Things aren't only not bad, they're actually good. And now you start this cycle where now they're hearing, oh my god, this person doesn't even understand at all what I'm talking about. Things are really, really bad. No, things are great. Things are the end of the universe. No, things are the best they've ever been. And you end up, rather than reaching consensus, you actually end up polarizing yourselves, because as their argument becomes more and more strident in this effort to try to make you understand what they're saying, you're becoming more and more polarized on the opposite side in order to try to counteract this extremism that you're hearing. So this is something that happened with me and one of the other leads on Dragon Age Origins, because we just were pulling each other apart. The lesson that I needed to learn, the lesson that I think helps diffuse this in a lot of situations, is you need to go to where the person is. You need to acknowledge what they're saying. You need to hear what they're saying. You need to understand what they're saying, and you need to make them understand that you hear and understand what they're saying. Because once you've done that, once they understand that they are at least getting through to you, then they are more open to the conversation about why their position might be overly extreme. But if you don't start with that listening and hearing and understanding and communicating your listening and hearing and understanding, you are going to pull your relationship apart with people that are expressing more extreme views, because they're going to entrench further and further and further because they think you're just not hearing them. And unfortunately, this isn't conscious on their part. So you need to be the one to reach across to pull them forward. This is a lesson that I learned after Dragon Age Origins from what happened on Dragon Age Origins. I like to think that I've internalized it really well. I hope I have, because it is critically important that you be able to work with people that express their concerns in different ways and not take someone who is slightly worried about something and turn them into someone who is unbelievably worried about something simply because of your inability to acknowledge that concern. Okay, here at the end, I thought I would do a little bit about Dragon Age 4. At least Dragon Age 4 through the lens of Dragon Age Origins. We're 40 minutes in, so I might pull this part out into its own video as well, just so a few more people can see it. When you look at Dragon Age 4 through the lens of what happened on Dragon Age Origins, you actually see a lot of similarities. The team has been working on it for a really long time. The overall project direction has changed a couple of times. It's gone one way and then come back to its original goals. Some key leadership members have departed and been replaced. I was the third or possibly fourth executive producer on Dragon Age Origins, depending on how you count. The creative director changed late in the development of Dragon Age Origins as well. But Dragon Age Origins came out and it was very successful. I'm very confident in Dragon Age 4. I believe in that team. I believe in that vision. I believe that there is a continuity of vision and development within that team that is capable of making an incredibly amazing game. And I think they are well positioned to do that. AAA games aren't made by individuals. This isn't about my brilliant vision driving a game to completion. It's about the collective vision, the collective ideas, the collective creativity of the team. And while people have left the Dragon Age team, most of that team knows this IP. Most of that team knows how to make a great game. My belief is that they're going to do that. I have every confidence in that team. And honestly, I believe that EA is going to give them the space to do that. I think that EA learned lessons from Mass Effect Andromeda and from Anthem and from the Mass Effect trilogy remaster and from Jedi Fallen Order. And all of those lessons, I think, will help Dragon Age to be a great game. Don't worry about Dragon Age 4 because I'm not on it. Don't worry about Dragon Age 4 because any one person isn't on it. This is a large team, and large teams have resiliency when it comes to the departure of individuals. That brings us into Dragon Age. I've been feeling a lot of resistance to doing this particular video. I'm not sure if that will just be the dam bursting and now we'll do the remaining few in a rush, or if each of these is going to be harder than the last one. I guess we will see. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up so that YouTube will spread it to more people. If you have any questions about Dragon Age Origins development, ask it down in the comments. Share this video with your friend who loves Dragon Age and maybe they never played Dragon Age Origins. It's worth a look. I will see you again soon. Thank you.